through to specification questions. So we'd like to make this kind of a discussion session at the end. So that we're just going to start off with a presentation talking about how things get from kind of issues to changes in the specification. But it's also your chance to ask questions of any of the process. And also we have a lot of the editors represented in here. So I'm going to paste a link to the document in the chat. Feel free to put questions in the document and we'll come back to them at the end. Or if you put them into the chat and I'll make note of them and we'll circle back. So with that, I'll pass over to Tom, who's going to introduce the editors.
Yeah. Hi there. You can all hear me, I hope. Yeah. Cool. Right. Yeah. So I'm going to introduce the editors. So who are the editors? The editorial committee is formally defined in IIIF. In the there was a memorandum of understanding that created the IIIF consortium in June 2015. And so there were editors of the specs before then, but this document formalized them. If we go on to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm just going to read this quote. Yeah, editorial committee creates and maintains the technical specifications, helps to identify and promulgate best practices and patterns of interoperability based on use cases, which we'll see in a minute, community input, and web standards. As an organization that derives its strengths from the active participation of a distributed community, some of whom are here, the IIIF Consortium values diversity, inclusiveness, and transparency in its operations and activities. So you can read that definition of the committee in the MOU. Next slide. Yeah, so this is us at the moment. There are 6 editors right now. So Mike Appleby from Yale, Dawn Childress from UCLA, me, Tom Crane from Digerati, Jeff Mixter from OCLC, Rob Sanderson from Yale, and Simeon Warner from Cornell. And our Slack handles are there. Sorry, yeah, well, you can check them out. I mean, or find us on Slack if you need to talk to us. Yeah, and there are 2 former editors who were also formalized under that process. So Maria Whitaker, who's now retired and enjoying post work, and John Stroop of Princeton University Library. But before it was formalized, so this is a good opportunity, this session, because we didn't know to do this. So I'm going to kind of name all the people who are named in specs back to the dawn of time. So there are 3 former named editors: Ben Alberton, Stuart Snibman, and Marcus Enders. And there are also spec authors, because back in those really early versions of the specs, when the presentation API didn't even exist, it was called the metadata API, or you could use XML in IIIF. There were a whole load of other authors of specs, and I'm not going to read them out because we'll be here for ages. So what do? Well, we write the specs, and the process that we follow to do that is that's the subject of this session today. Now, those specs are the work of the whole community. Our shared use cases become crystallized in those specifications. And those specifications allow our use cases to be realized in software and give us that interoperability. But it's important that the specifications have a coherent editorial voice and are consistent and harmonious with each other, because there are now lots of specs, there are 5, 6, even more specs. So our job as editors is to write the things, but also ensure that kind of harmony across them all, across the specs. Now, in fact, what we do most of the time is argue about Oxford commas and whether 2 spaces should follow a full stop. That's not all we do. We also hope that our work allows a kind of software ecosystem to bubble up from this family of emerging specifications. And crucially, we across those specifications, we're trying to ensure that they follow these principles, and there's a link to the principles there, and we can talk about these principles in a later section of today's session. So those principles ensure that the specifications we produce meet the requirements, but are no more complicated than they need to be to meet those requirements. And sometimes that means that we deliberately do not address certain use cases or do not formally handle specific scenarios. But also the existence of the cookbook and the recipes in the cookbook has greatly enhanced the ability of the specifications to focus more on spec and not be kind of bogged down with thousands of examples of all the wonderful things we can do in IIIF. And finally, we kind of hope those specs are good to read. So how do you get involved in IIIF editorial work? So the technical specification groups are great things to join. So the current, there are current TSGs for search, which we heard about yesterday, for auth, for 3D, for maps. I'm going to forget all the fantastic technical specification groups there are, but that's a good, that's a good way to get involved, because usually, or in fact, a technical specification group has at least one editor as one of the chairs. Cookbook recipes are great ways to get involved in editorial work, and periodically, like Time Lords, IIIF editors regenerate, and don't last forever. So new editors are required, and those processes, involvement in TSGs and working on cookbook recipes, are good ways of kind of helping us replenish the pool of editors. I think I'm going to hand over now to. Sorry, I didn't ask for the next slide. I just talked through this slide, but yeah, I am going to hand over now, I think, to Jeff, who is next.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to go over sort of how to let your voice be heard. So how to go about sharing the stories, and how then are they collected. So as Tom mentioned, probably the most important channel for communication is Slack. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with Slack, but just so if folks aren't on the channel yet for IIIF, in these slides is that link to the request form. Next slide, please. So in Slack, there's a variety of channels. As mentioned, there are sort of community channels, there's channels for specific TSG groups, there's general technical channel, there's also just a general channel. And this is an avenue or opportunity for folks to ask questions, make comments. This is an example of a comment that was answered. So this is a pretty sort of short, I have a question, how do I do this? This is how you do it. But next slide, please. If an issue is raised and picked up, it can once it has been sort of verified as an issue, it can be put into GitHub. And once the issue has been created in GitHub, that is an indication that this issue is now being tracked, and it will be taken care of accordingly. It'll obviously have the issue number, any comments associated with it, sort of the context for what caused this issue to be raised and tracked. So this is where, if you're interested in following the specific issues that have been sort of gleaned out of either Slack messages or, as I'll talk about in a minute, group meetings, this is where you can find those. Next slide, please. So in addition to either tracking them in GitHub or sharing or finding about them in Slack, there are also specific meetings folks can join. So as Tom mentioned, there are a couple of those. There are dedicated meetings where groups of interested people will get together for things like 3D or maps. There's also more sort of general working meetings. There are a couple of those that were held impromptu at the recent IIIF meeting in Boston in June of this year. But there's also online meeting opportunities. So these are sort of these community groups, and we have sort of two broad categories of community groups. There are community groups, which typically follow like a theme, like maps, for example, the map community group. And then there's also technical working groups, which are they're officially chartered, and they have sort of a charge to do something that typically results in an updating of a specification, or in some cases, the creation of a brand new IIIF specification. So again, these are two different types of opportunities for people to share their user stories that can then become reflected in GitHub issues that then ultimately could result in changes to the specifications or new cookbook recipes, for example, things like that. Next slide. So with that, I will turn things over to Mike to walk through a couple of examples.
Okay. Yeah, just to pick up on this. So if we're at the stage where we have a GitHub issue and we want to think about where it might go, there are a couple of options. One, we might take that issue and actually make an update to the specifications if it's fairly narrowly scoped. Another path would be to refer that issue to an existing technical specification group, or maybe even form a new technical specification group if it's raised a significant issue that needs to be addressed in that way. And then finally, it could lead to development of a recipe in the IIIF cookbook. So let's just look at an example for each of these. Next slide. So here's an example of a specification change. And it's basically a request to change the name of a property from license to rights. Now, this was discussed. It seemed like a good idea to everybody. The editors voted to do it, but this is what's known as a breaking change, right? If we were to just change this in the spec, software clients would have problems because they'd be looking for the licensed property and not rights. So we had to queue this change up for the next major specification release. So this was we were in 2.1, and so it had to wait for version 3 of the presentation API before we could actually implement the change. There are changes, and actually part of this involved a change to the JSON LD context file, which is not semantically versioned. So we were able to make that change right away, even though we had to wait for version 3.0 of the spec to actually change the name of the property in the specification itself. There are other types of editorial changes, clarifications, typos, if they've managed to sneak in, things like that can, if they're pointed out in an issue, can lead to a direct change to the specifications. Next slide. Other issues can lead to the creation of a technical specification group. So here's a very old one. We knew that there was a community, desire to be able to reference a physical location from a IIIF resource. We didn't have the bandwidth really to address this early on. Eventually, starting around 2018, and there was enough interest from the geospatial community to start talking about this. And then next slide. And so this led to the formation of the IIIF Maps community group and the technical specification group. So this brought together enough people who had expertise in geospatial to have a good discussion about what extensions to the presentation API would look like that addressed not only the need to associate a manifest with this one specific location, but now there's also discussion of georeferencing and other topics sort of under that space. So next slide. And the first output of the maps group is the navplace extension. So here's a formal extension specified as a document, and that's available online now. So that's a really productive way for a user story to convert into an output that's not a direct change to the presentation API or the image API, but is a new document, in this case in the extension space. The technical specification groups also, the scope of them is varied really widely. So on the small end, the text granularity group defined one extension property for annotations, and that was the output of that one. Maps, we're seeing at least 2 substantial extensions will be produced in the maps group. On the other end of the scale, the AV technical specification group defined how audio and video would work in IIIF, and that was the basis really for the version 3 of the presentation API. So that was a huge undertaking. The scope of these can vary widely, and depending on the use case and kind of what the community can support in terms of creating the new specs. Next slide. The cookbook, which has been mentioned before, is another place where issues can sort of result in a published document. So the cookbook provides examples that we don't have room to really include in the spec, but that demonstrate how to use the APIs. The goal is to really encourage adoption of common patterns by both the publishers of IIIF resources and also give a clear target for client developers to understand what the expected patterns are, so that the client behavior in different viewers and software clients can be consistent. Next slide, please. And so one example of an open issue right now is this one, talking about basically how to link to OCR from a manifest. And here, Ben's pointing out that there are different patterns in the community for that, and it would be great to have a recipe to, to get some consistency and to understand kind of what the right pattern to adopt is as a publisher, but then also what software clients might expect when picking that up. I think next slide, and Rob, I'll hand over to Rob.
Yep. I was asked to talk about the process and policies around the editorial work. And there is a page which is linked there in the slide about all of the requirements, which I'm not going to talk through in any great detail because you would all be bored to absolute tears. But instead, to focus on the actual process rather than the musts and shoulds and must nots. We use GitHub for all of our specification work. And looking at the issue list, it turns out that I have created 577 issues out of the 1,150 odd issues in the API repository, which is more than all of the other editors across all time combined. So does that mean that I've done all the work? No, absolutely not. What actually happens is, as Jeff was saying, when an issue is raised, in order for it to be tracked, we need to enter it into GitHub as an issue, so that then when there is a solution to it, we can then close it and know that it has been resolved. So it just has happened that I've entered more of the issues rather than that I've done all of the work. So once the issue is opened, we discuss back again, this isn't mine. We discuss what the possible solutions to that issue would be. And some issues are merely closed, they never get resolved, they're not deemed to be actually an issue. But assuming that there is some resolution possible, then either via the TSG or via the editorial committee directly, a pull request is opened against the spec to make the change. That then gets essentially approved by the editors after reviewing what the change is, and also depending on the scale of the change, it could be announced via IIIF Discuss, particularly for full specifications, not so much for typos and more minor changes. As of, I believe it was 2018, there has been the technical review committee, which is going to be the topic of this next slide, which then approves changes to the specifications to make sure that the changes are not just the work of the few editors, but actually the entire community is on board and understands what is happening and why, and the changes are for the benefit of everyone. So I'll pass it over to Jeff to talk about the TRC.
Great, thank you. So as mentioned, as issues are tackled and resolved, or work is ready to go, ready to go into production, for lack of a better term, it goes through a TRC review. So the TRC is a technical review committee, and it's a representative of the consortium and the community with regards to technical matters. And its purpose is to review and ratify or reject proposals to solve technical issues in an ongoing fashion. And these types of decisions include, as others had mentioned, reviewing new or updates to the specifications, reviewing specific cookbook entries, as well as reviewing proposals for the formation and charters of new TSGs. So you can find more information on the TRC, including who is on it, how voting for new members works, the rollover period, things like that at that link at the bottom. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through a couple of quick examples of the TRC process. So this was an example of a proposal that was submitted to the TRC. It was rejected by the TRC, and it has since not come back for review. So just through a couple of screenshots here from the GitHub tracking, this is the TRC thing issue that is voted on. So in it, you can see a link to the original GitHub issue that was created. The pull request, the Git pull request that would resolve this issue if it were approved by the TRC. In this case, because this is a change to the specification, there's a link to the specification that is requested to be changed, or that is proposed to be changed. And then the last link, there's a preview, which will show you what would the spec look like if this was approved. And then you can also just see some background and summary. So typically this is pulled from the GitHub issue, as well as comments that are discussions via comments that went on throughout the work. Next slide, please. And then another section, if you were to scroll down, would be the proposed solution. So this is what is being proposed to change that is reflected in the pull request. Then at the bottom of that screenshot, you can see the voting process via a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a confused face. Next slide, please. And then lastly, again, I said this issue was rejected. So once the votes are totaled and completed, there's a process, so things will go out for review. There's a meeting in which people, someone will present the issue for voting. And then there's a 2-week window after that. I believe it's 2 weeks to get the votes in to be counted. But again, you can see the results then of the vote are totaled, summarized, and then a decision is made. Next slide, please. So the last one, this is an example of a issue that was proposed, initially rejected, and then brought back for as a proposal, and it was then accepted and adopted. So again, you can see the sort of the pertinent information here, the original issue, the pull request, the preview of what would happen if this was adopted, the background to it. Next slide, please. And then this was, again, the summary. So comments on why it was rejected. And then if you go to the next slide, please. This issue was then actually then taken back for consideration by the MAPS working group. And it was then resubmitted shortly thereafter. And again, the sort of pertinent information there. Next slide, please. And then sort of the results. So there was, this issue was reapproved or approved once it was resubmitted. So that sort of is the workflow, and that's how things happen through the TRC. Next slide. So then once an issue is approved by the TRC, the corresponding Git pull request is merged, and then the change has then as a result, officially been adopted by the IIIF specifications. And I think at this point, we can turn it over to questions.
Great, thanks. So again, questions in the chat or the document. I've got a few pre-canned questions, which are really tough ones. So if you want to save the editors, then please do kind of add some questions in the chat. So the first one, I think the most important one, Trip, and this is in context, Tom, of your statement that the editors are like time lords. So do the editors get sonic screwdrivers? Probably an easy one.
Yeah, but I'm not allowed to show it to you, I'm afraid. But you just have to take our words for it.
Great. So next question. What's the main work you're looking at in the next 6 months as the editor group and the kind of specifications going forward?
Well, I could do that one as well. Well, I could do some of that one. because so I guess one thing we've been looking at is auth. So as some of you might know, the current auth spec has several problems. One of them is a kind of cosmetic problem in that it's, like the search spec was, it's still kind of using the language of JSON-LD version 1 and presentation 2. So it needs to be brought into alignment with presentation 3 and use JSON-LD 1.1 constructions and use the same language maps and other nice things that are being used across the specs. A second more interesting issue with it is the kind of changing browser behaviors with respect to third-party cookies, which is a difficult problem which we need to kind of grapple with. And then the third issue of with auth is actually it needs to encompass far more scenarios than just access control over image API endpoints, which is what the current auth spec does. It needs to deal with the presence of auth on audio, video, static images, linked documents like PDFs or anything like that. And then actually a fourth, so it's like the Spanish Inquisition, a fourth issue is, which is slightly different from access control over media, is access control over other IIIF resources like annotation lists or search results or things like that. So now that's a kind of multi-step process, but the first part of that process is very much like search, to release a new version of auth that aligns with the current presentation 3 and also supports any resource on the web that has auth associated with it, and also partially at least deals with some of the third-party cookie issues. We're actually having an in-person meeting next month to do some work on auth. I'll let other editors speak about other activities though.
Jeff, Rob, Mike, any other work on the horizon?
I'll just mention that the editors are involved in the TSGs as well. So the maps TSG, for instance, is working on a specification for georeferencing, and then so that's something that we'd be looking forward to in the next 6 months.
I should also mention that Dawn's not here, but she's on the search TSG as well. I know there's kind of work upcoming with that as well. Okay, next question. It's kind of related to the following two, but could you go through the design principles for IIIF? Rob, are you still mute if you're... Still on mute, Rob? Still can't hear you, I'm afraid, Rob. Not just me, is it?
No, it's not just you.
No. Great, thanks for that.
So yeah, can we share the page? I put the link into the chat. So there's a bunch of design principles which we distilled a while ago, 2018, 2017 or so. It's the one, thank you. From the work that we had done of the previous versions of the specs, to try to understand why was IIIF at that point becoming successful. Now I would say is very successful. Because while we were thinking about it, it would be good to write them down so that we could try to ensure their continued use and thus the continued success of the work. So I won't, you can read them all in detail, but to go through them quickly: scope design through shared use cases. So this is very much core to the IIIF process, as we've talked about already. If there isn't a shared use case, then there's no need for a spec. Select solutions that are as simple as possible and no simpler, attributed, I think misattributed to Einstein. But essentially, if there is an easy way to do it and a complex way to do it, then pick the easy way. But if the easy way doesn't actually solve the problem, then you still need to add some complexity. Intelligently manage ramping up means essentially it should be easy to do the easy things and possible to do the hard things. So it should be easy to get started. And as Mike showed earlier this morning with the IIIF Prezi3 library, creating a valid, complete manifest with just 3 lines of Python code seems pretty easy. But of course, if you want to have AV and all of the other functionality that IIIF enables, then you need to work forwards from that baseline. Avoid dependency on specific technologies. So, for example, a lot of institutions use JPEG 2000, but that doesn't mean that the image API is predicated on the existence of JPEG 2000, because there's also a lot of institutions that use pyramidal TIFFs. Equally, ensure that the APIs don't require a particular system, a particular platform, software implementation to implement them, and they can be built from the ground up with relative ease. Use resource-oriented design, or REST. So essentially, everything should have a URI. When you go to that URI, you get the thing. And related to that, don't break web caches. Caching on the web is fundamental in this day and age. So make sure that all of the APIs respect web caches and caching, respect content distribution networks, and so forth. Follow linked data principles. So this is further down the list, and note, of course, that all of the IIIF APIs are linked data because they're JSON-LD. However, that doesn't mean that you should try to implement the image API with a triple store because that's using the wrong tool for the job. So we should follow the principles of linked data, and the following one, design for JSON-LD first, because the data should be usable by developers. So one of the key takeaways from IIIF's success is that instead of optimizing for the end user and making it awfully complicated for the developer, instead if we optimize for the developers who actually use the data, then there will be a lot more implementations because it's easy to implement. And then some of those will rise to the top, some will fall away, but at the end of the day, there's a lot more use and a lot more adoption of the spec. Use existing standards where possible, and we're coming sort of down towards the bottom of the list here. So if there are existing standards, then we should use them, but not at the expense of the previous principles. Follow best practices where possible. Same thing, if there's a best practice rather than a standard, then we should use it, but again, not if it makes it more complicated, and thus would reduce adoption. And finally, separate concerns and loosely couple APIs. This is maybe the one of the least followed ones. So the image API can be implemented totally separately from the presentation API. And presentation API doesn't require the image API at all. You could have only static images in the presentation API. You could implement search without the presentation API, but it would be very hard. It would be basically impossible to implement. Well, yeah, it would be not sensible to implement auth without other IIIF APIs. So yeah, we try to keep them as separate as possible, but they are still coupled together in defined ways to ensure that we have a coherent set of specs, but that you're not required to implement all of them, because that would break the intelligently manage ramping up principle. Define success, not failure, is to specify what should happen when a client does something, or when the server does something. We express things in the positive rather than negative. So if if a client asks for a particular image API construction, then this is what happens. But we don't say if the client asks for something outside of the spec, then the server should return an error message. So that allows us to extend the APIs without running into breaking changes, because if everything not specified was forbidden, then any addition would be a breaking change. And finally, but also perhaps it should be moved up further to the top, 13, designed for worldwide use. Make sure that all of the specs are internationalizable, which has become a lot easier with presentation 3. And we are, of course, working to update search, as you've seen, auth and so forth, to use the additional language functionalities that JSON LD 1.1 gives us with language maps. I won't go through the JSON LD design principles. They're a bit more technically specific, but essentially there's also equivalent technical principles for how to build a IIIF API using JSON LD, such as avoid explicit namespaces, use camel case, always use arrays for multiple value properties, and so on and so forth. So yes, thank you to whoever put that question in. I think it's really important to have at least this degree of understanding of the principles, because it really informs how IIIF works. And if anyone is interested in sort of understanding the mindset of the editors, this principles document is absolutely the first place to look, because it lays out the aspects which we think are the fundamental ones for IIIF.
Great, thanks, Rob. So I'll just quickly ask this Born Digital one, and then I'll skip over to the people's questions. So Tom, you presented yesterday in the lightning talk about how to model Born Digital in IIIF. And I wonder whether there are kind of various possibilities where this could go. This could be kind of a TSG, this could be kind of an extension, this could be something that just the welcome does. And all of those is kind of a very open process. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, Tom.
Yeah, so the reason I thought it'd be interesting to do a lightning talk is it's a problem that I've heard from many sources. You have multiple types of material that you're trying to shoehorn into a IIIF manifest, and some of them are not fundamentally aligned with the kind of presentation of extents of space and time that IIIF's all about. But I'm a bit hesitant actually about kind of formalizing that work in any way, because I think it's a really good example of using custom behaviors. So what you will see eventually when those welcome manifests start getting published is an additional context at the top of the manifest that define two custom behavior terms. And the point about it is that even if there is only one client in the world, which is welcome's item page, that understands those behaviors and reacts to them and does something different in the user interface with them, then that's fine, because crucially it hasn't broken anything else. It's still giving useful information to generic IIIF consumers. It's just a kind of, it's just a little tweak, a little enhancement to allow a kind of bit of local functionality. Now, it might turn out that exact same pattern is really useful for many, many other people, and they can do similar things. I would, as I kind of pointed out in the thing, I would not like to see 90% of the world's IIIF manifests being Born Digital content, because it's fundamentally not what IIIF is for. It's just really solving this issue of focusing on IIIF as the carrier of your items to their pages or their viewers, and just coming up with a non-breaking solution to that. So I'm just kind of, I'm slightly hesitant about let's set up a TSG to kind of formalize that stuff. I just want to let it be out there and see how it goes. But other people may differ. So yeah. I mean, and in a way, it doesn't need. If it ever became formalized in any way, it would just be a recipe. I think. I mean, those two behaviors could go in the in the extensions. I don't think they kind of should go anywhere near like presentation 4 or anything like that anytime soon. They could, at most be extensions, registered extensions. But that's just my thinking. Yeah, I don't know what anyone else thinks about it.
Rob, you've gone 100% Tom in chat. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so the original use case that led to IIIF back in 2011 was medieval manuscripts, and it really informed the Canvas notion. So the born digital work of here is a document that doesn't have pages and doesn't have views, it's just content, really challenges the entire paradigm of IIIF, at least the presentation API. So yeah, I agree with Tom that what we should be looking for is a way to not change the way that Born Digital is done, because I would say that IIIF has changed the way in which digital images and presentation online has been done. But instead to find the appropriate touch points where IIIF can work with Born Digital content, rather than trying to squash Born Digital into a model that isn't really suited to it. So it's less like, I would say Born Digital is harder than 3D, looking ahead to the 10th question, because we know that 3D is spatial. Right, it's got 3 dimensions of space rather than just 2, but it's still spatial, whereas Born Digital doesn't have any such dimensions necessarily. So yeah, recipes, and this is an extensions, a list of possible use cases and how different approaches could be put into practice with different clients in different situations. But yeah, and version N of the presentation API, I think, would be a very high N compared to AV and 3D, which are still inherently spatial.
Thanks. And hopefully, Joe, we've covered you've asked a question better than I did, so hopefully we've covered that. So the next one is, are there any examples or specs, features or elements that didn't work out the way you expected them to?
The silence does not indicate that the answer to that question is no. I expect we're just trying to go through all the things that is true of. Auth certainly went through several crises of like, how does this work? That is not going to work. Yeah.
Yes, there's even a version called Lost Summer, if I recall correctly, which is we spent an entire summer trying to figure out one particular issue with Auth, and then decided no, that's not going to work, and went back to the previous version.
And I think cookbooks have been interesting in some of this, because they're kind of group participation, group kind of implementation of some of these features. And it does mean that we're going to come back to the editors for asking clarification. So I think there's lots of the cookbook experience has come across this.
Yeah, I think all of the changes between major versions would fit into this category as well. So the one that I think Jeff mentioned about rights versus license. We thought we wanted license, but actually no, we really did mean rights. Or collections originally in the presentation API had 2 properties, one for manifest and one for collections, but then we couldn't interleave them. So we ended up with items, which then is the only way to do it now in presentation 3. So yeah, I think all of the iterations of the specs over the last decade have been when the features solve one problem but exposed another.
I'd also say, just to address Matt Jordan's question there, that what a really good example of this is the work on AV, where we kind of entered that work with the assumption that there would be something coming out of it that was kind of similar to the image API, like an AV API. Very similar, in fact, to the one that Chris Thatcher of Library of Congress demoed. I didn't attend the call, but they demoed that on the AV call on Monday. A bitstream API for AV, so you could select different transformations, fragments, etc., of video streams and audio streams in the way you can select parts of images with the image API. But when we actually got into the work and really, and this is the kind of crucial use case scenario, when we looked at what people's use cases actually were and what they were doing with it, it became far more obvious and important for us to establish our spatial space for AV to happen in before we got anywhere near looking at bitstream APIs. So presentation 3 became about allowing durations on canvases and allowing lots of additional behaviors and all that kind of stuff that support use of AV, because most people are not dealing with partial, fragment tile-like requests to AV resources. They just need to show the thing, have annotation space for the thing, all that kind of stuff. And there are already existing standards like HLS and MPEG- that do the kind of tile equivalent, vaguely equivalent functionality. And we didn't necessarily think our priorities were on doing something similar to that. That doesn't mean that we couldn't come back to a bitstream API for AV in the future, because clearly there are some, there are real use cases for it. It's actually really quite exciting and interesting. But it turned out that the AV technical specification group produced a presentation spec, spatial spec, not a bitstream spec at the end of its work.
Great, thank you. I think the AV example is a great one. So we've just got about 2 more minutes. So I wonder if we can do this one quickly. So Rob indicated that if you have one use case, you do not need a spec. So do we have a list of use cases looking for more use cases? And I'll click on this link.
Yep, so there is a use cases needed label in GitHub for issues that are added and then discussed, but the use cases either aren't thought of as being sufficient. Like cropping rotation is from 2015, which is when you rotate an image in the image API, you end up with a non-rectilinear image, right? So surely it would be good to have that bottom case where you end up with a square being the minimum box, the minimum rectangular image. But why? No one's actually asked for this. It seems like a useful thing to have, but if no one's going to use it, why would we complicate the spec by adding it? So it's been, as you can see from the comments, discussed over the years. We brought it to community call in 2018 and continued to defer. We still don't have anyone clamoring for it. So why complicate the spec with something that no one actually wants? And the same applies to all of the other issues with that tag. So yeah, there's no need for interoperability if there's only one system that's ever going to implement it. It just makes everyone's life more difficult, because at the very least you need to understand the thing that you don't actually want to then not implement it.
Great, thanks. And perfectly on time. So we didn't get to the 3D question, but this is a great advertisement for the next session, which is all dedicated to 3D. And it's still very early in the process, so I look forward to that. So another 10-minute break now, and then we'll be back for the 3D showcase. Thanks all.